Yuan Chen, Elegy number 3. I sit here grieving for the two of us. How much of life's span remains for me? Deng Yo lost his son and railed at destiny. Pan Jue mourned his wife, composing futile verses. Shall we share a hollow in the netherworld, or reborn meet in some other troubled life? All night long my eyes will see once more your brow's deep furrows carved by a life of care. So this is the third and last of the 3 elegiac poems that Yuan Shen wrote for his wife and that were included in the 300 Tang poems anthology. As such, the subject matter of this third elegy is very similar to the 2 previous elegies that we've read. Basically, a lament, a complaint at the early death and absence of Yuan Shen's wife, especially at the fact that not only is she absent, but that she died before Yuan Shen reached a certain level of prosperity that would have allowed him to give her the kind of life that he thinks a virtuous woman like his deceased wife deserved. So this poem is more similar to the first one than to the second one in the fact that it includes, in the second couplet, 2 historical references to figures from the Eastern Jin dynasty that would not be easy to understand for modern readers, and which we will clarify in a minute. The second poem seemed simpler, or at least more straightforward. Again, we have to take into account that for a Chinese scholar official, the references that appear here would have been staple fare, part of the historical chronicles and the poems that any scholar official who had passed the examinations would know. So they wouldn't be, probably these 2 references wouldn't be at all arcane or difficult to understand. So again, lament at parting and early death of the wife, and lament at the fact that she died when Yuan Chen was poor, and speculations in this case, not about the past or objects related to the woman, but about what will happen in the future, in the afterlife of husband and wife. So as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. I sit here grieving for the two of us. How much of life's span remains for me? So the poem starts, you could say in media res, with the poet, sad, thinking about his deceased wife, and projecting into the future, into how much an allotted lifespan has or remains in his possession. Whereas the other poems generally focused on the past, this one seems to be a little bit focused on the future, and with the focus on the death, on the future death of Yuan Chen, and on what will happen then, and if he will join his wife or not. So this is the slightly different element in this poem as opposed to the others, although you could say that the second of the elegies also put a lot of emphasis on the present suffering of Yuan Chen. This one, relocates us towards the future. How much life is left? And we will talk about the metaphysical speculations about life after death that the Chinese of the Tang dynasty might have when we reach the third couplet. Second couplet. Deng Yo lost his son and railed at destiny. Pan Yue mourned his wife, composing futile verses. So this is the second couplet, and as usual, this is a perfect parallelistic couplet. And we get Deng Yo parallels Pan Yue, loss of son, mourning wife, rail, composing, destiny, futile verses. So, the parallelism is pretty close, even in the translation. So the second couplet puts Yuan Chen's loss in perspective by referencing 2 figures from the Eastern Jin dynasty who also lost close family members. Deng Yo, who lost a son, and Pan Yue, who is perhaps a better parallelism for Yuan Chen because he lost his wife. So let's clarify these 2 references. The 2 are from the Eastern Jin dynasty. So the Eastern Jin dynasty, which lasted from well, actually they are from between the Western Jin and the Eastern Jin dynasty. So the Jin dynasty lasted from 266 to 420 of our era, divided into two parts: Western Jin 266 316 and Eastern Jin 317 420. Now the Western Jin was the last period in which China was a unified empire until almost the time of the Tang. If you will remember, we talked about the Three Kingdoms period after the collapse of the Han. During the first half of the 3rd century of our era, China was divided into three states: the states of Wei, Shu, and the one in the southeast was. Well, I don't remember right now. Which was the third one? Wu. Yes. Wei, Shu, and Wu. And in the middle of the 3rd century, the ministers of the Sima family in the northern state usurped the throne and ended up conquering the other two kingdoms, unifying China. But this unification was short-lived. Emperor Wu of the Jin dynasty unified the empire, but at the time of his death, he left at the end of the 3rd century, he left the throne to an underaged and mentally incapacitated son, Emperor Hui. He had also divided the empire amongst his other sons and relatives, giving them a lot of power, which meant that during his son's reign, the empire was torn apart in battles between the different princes who wanted to usurp the throne, the Wars of the Eight Princes. The dynasty was left so weakened by this that at the beginning of the 4th century, a group of barbarians managed to invade the north and take the capital of China, forcing a minor member of the imperial line to run away to the south, where he would found, this was Emperor Yuan, he would found the Eastern Jin dynasty that would last for another 100 years, controlling the territories of the Yangtze and the Huai River. So this is the background of the Jin dynasty, especially of the Western Jin and the beginning of the Eastern Jin. Now these two figures, Deng Yo and Pan Yue, are important figures of this period. So let's start with let's start with Pan Yue. So Pan Yue was a very, very, very famous poet. I think we've talked about him before. So Pan Yue, courtesy name An Ren, lived from 247 to 300. Was one of the greatest poets of the Western Jin period. Very famous for a lot of his works. He was also famous for being a bit of a Casanova. He was a very handsome man, to the extreme that even today his name is a Chinese byword for handsome man. And the anecdote was that he was so handsome that when he walked around the capital, the women would, throw fruits at his chariot. Because he was so handsome. Today, his claim to fame basically rests on some poems he wrote on the death of his young wife. Basically 3 poems to his dead wife, which probably Yuan Chen is imitating in these 3 elegies. And one line from one of those poems: "We were a pair of birds nesting in the woods. One woke in the morning to find himself alone." So Pan Yue is a very good example, very good model for Yuan Chen to pattern himself on, because he is, just like him, a poet that has lost his beloved wife. So very good example, although it might make one doubt at the degree of sincerity of Yuan Chen, because his poems and his feelings match too well those of another poet of a distant time and age. So Pan Yue from about 500 years before Yuan Chen's time. Now the other example adapts a little bit less well to Yuan Chen's situation, because it's the loss of a son by a father. So Deng Yo was also a person from the Western Jin dynasty, more strictly from the Western Jin, Eastern Jin. So Pan Yue didn't make it into the Eastern Jin during the warfare at the time of the Wars of the Eight Princes. He was executed. And Deng Yo was also serving in office at that time. He was a relatively prestigious official who had a reputation of being a good administrator, beloved by the people under his charge. And he did manage to survive all the infighting. But when the barbarians invaded the country during the Zhongjia era, he escaped into the mountains, barely saving his life. And he ran away with his wife and with his own son and his young brother's son. And there was no food, they were in the mountains, they were exhausted, and the situation was such that it would not allow them to continue to carry both children. So his wife said to him that, let's leave our son behind, because we will be able to have another son. But on the contrary, your deceased brother-in-law's son, if he dies now, well, he will cut your deceased brother's line. So Deng Yo left behind his own son and kept his nephew Deng Sui at his side. And later on, Deng Yo would serve the emperor who founded the southern state. He would never have children, but his nephew would treat him with the respect as if he were his own flesh and blood father. So Deng Yo lost his son and railed at destiny. He didn't compose poetry, but he complained that destiny forced him to choose. And, he was later taken as an example. This anecdote that I'm telling you about appears in the chronicle of the state of Jin. And, he's a paramount exemplar of the good civil servant, so virtuous, so noble, that he saved his brother's son instead of saving his own son. So, two examples of people who lost a close relative and who grieved about this to no use. So from that point of view, they would be good examples, good precedents for mapping onto Yuan Chen's own suffering, pain, and loss. Okay, let's continue with the next couplet. Third couplet. Shall we share a hollow in the netherworld, or reborn meet in some other troubled life? So what is going to happen to Yuan Chen and his wife? Will they ever meet again? As opposed to the Western tradition, the Chinese, at the time of the Tang Dynasty, didn't have an altogether unquestionable point of view on what happened after death. In fact, the religious beliefs of the Chinese at this time were, very syncretistic. They were a mix of different traditions. There was Confucianism, which was the main doctrine held onto by the scholar officials. But Confucianism, even though it had acquired some metaphysical and proto-religious elements during the Han Dynasty, was basically a philosophical school with ethical rules for correct behavior. So it didn't speculate much about the supernatural, about life after death. Confucians sacrificed to their ancestors, but in the Analects, I think, Confucius clearly states the possibility that, the ancestors do not exist as spirits living somewhere else. He says, it doesn't matter. You sacrifice to the ancestors if they exist, to honor them, and if they don't exist anywhere else, to keep the hierarchies and to honor the past, and that has a positive effect on the living and on perpetuating honor and hierarchy in the present. And there's another quote in the Analects, which I think says, the master never talked about rebellions and natural disasters and the spirits. So Confucius seems to have been pretty agnostic about the supernatural. So what happens after death? Well, the Confucians wouldn't speculate much, although traditional Chinese beliefs talked about the Yellow Springs, an area a little bit like the Jewish Sheol or the Greek Hades, where the souls of the dead went and probably languished and eventually disappeared. Another two schools of thought. Taoism had already been a contemporary of Confucius. It became a religion at the time of the fall of the Han. During the period of disunion, it became an established church with many followers and, a complex belief system of techniques and methods for attaining immortality or for going to paradises of Taoist deities. And finally, there's Buddhism, which also came in the period of disunion. Buddhism brings along the belief in reincarnation. So Buddhists believed that, if you had intense attachments, which were bad to people, but, we're only humans. So if you have an intense attachment to your wife, for example, perhaps when you both were reincarnated in the next life, you might be reincarnated, if not as husband and wife again, at least as people with a close relationship, because, karma continues from one life to the other. So in this couplet, Yuan Chen seems to be presenting the two possibilities. You could say the Confucian versus the Buddhist. What's going to happen to us? It says, shall we share a hollow in the netherworld? So this will be more the Confucian and the traditional idea. Shall we both share the same tomb and disappear? Shall we both go to the Yellow Springs and disappear and be together there in the darkness? Or shall we be reborn if Buddhist beliefs are true and we are to take them at their word, and meet in some other troubled life? Troubled life because for Buddhism all life is pain and all life is trouble. The ideal of nirvana is the breaking of the wheel of samsara, the breaking of attachment and the ceasing of reincarnations in this world. So what will happen? Will we lie together in the same hole in the ground? That would be the more materialistic point of view. Will we be together in the yellow springs under the ground? That would be the traditional Chinese belief. Will we reincarnate in another troubled life for you and me somewhere else? That would be the Buddhist belief. So speculations about what the future might hold. Finally, the last couplet brings us back to the present suffering and anguish of Yuan Chen, with a wink at the very common trope of seeing a beloved person in your dreams, traveling to a living beloved lover, husband, wife who is far away in the dream, or even if the other person is dead, going to visit them to the spirit world, perhaps in your dreams. All night long my eyes will see once more your brows deep furrows, carved by a life of care. So I will dream about you at night. I will go and visit you at night. But the thing that gets the focus in this nightly visit is not, the happiness of seeing the deceased wife, or the pain of parting from her, or the difficulty of getting to see her, but your brows deep furrows, carved by a life of care, seeing the physical signs in the deceased of the hard life, the hard work that the woman had to suffer. Remember, all these poems I've emphasized have hammered in the point that she died while they were poor, so she was not able to lead an easy and happy, completely happy life at his side. She led a life of toil and trouble, and that is still visible in the physical signs of her ghost, which night after night Yuan Chen visits. So quite a nice melancholy poem, and a nice and fitting conclusion to the trio of Yuan Chen's poems on his deceased wife.